Some bruises fade, others stay beneath the skin, like secrets no one dares to ask about. Have you ever known someone who'd rather walk alone in the snow than let pain chase them twice? This isn't just a story about a police officer and his old German shepherd. It's about what happens when a man who doesn't believe in second chances finds two newborns in the arms of a woman with nothing left to lose. What would you do if silence scratched at your door in the middle of the night? Stay with us until the end, even if you're the hardest heart to reach. And maybe you'll discover the quiet kind of miracle that still waits in the woods. The first snow of January had fallen without sound. No wind, no warning, only the steady hush of white settling over Flatwoods, West Virginia, like a memory nobody asked for, but everyone had to hold. Deputy Silas Kent drove with the window cracked half an inch. Cold air slipped in, sharp and clean, the way he liked it. In the passenger seat, Boone lay still, not asleep. Boone never slept on patrol. The truck moved slow along Timber Ridge. Not a real road, not anymore. Just a worn-out stretch of frozen earth where the pines leaned close like old men swapping secrets. It wasn't on any map the state updated, and that's exactly why Silas came here. No tourists, no traffic, just him and Boone and the long silence between. The radio hissed occasionally, a low, indifferent crackle, as if reluctant to speak. Silas took a sip of coffee gone bitter with cold. He didn't grimace, didn't do much of anything, really. At 43, he'd learned to move through life like fog, present but untouchable. After the accident 4 winters ago, he'd left the city, the shop, the gravestone, the pity, became a part-time traffic deputy in a place no one bothered to speed through, bought a cabin no one else wanted, and never left it unless Boone needed to stretch or a plow had missed something dangerous. Tonight wasn't about any of that. Tonight was just routine. Drive, breathe, disappear. And then Boone moved. It wasn't a bark or a sudden jolt, just a shift, his ears twitching toward the driver's side window, his gaze narrowing on something Silas couldn't yet see. His body stayed low but alert. Boone didn't bark much anymore. Not since the explosion in Colorado that cost him half his hearing and a good part of his speed. But the way he looked, when he looked, Silas had learned to listen. Silas tapped the brake. The truck slowed. Pine needles brushed the windshield in soft strokes. A few yards ahead, the ridge dipped slightly, a natural runoff where the snow gathered deep, untouched by tires or boots. Boone stared. "What is it, boy?" Silas said it without expecting an answer. Boone's tail flicked once. Then he stood, heavy bones creaking, and placed his front paws on the door panel. Silent. Silas opened the door and stepped out, boots crunching into snow that hadn't been walked on in days. The cold met him like a memory. Not painful, just familiar. He followed Boone's lead. The German shepherd moved slow, but with intent, toward the edge of the woods. No growl, no tension. Just that old, quiet pull he always seemed to have when something wasn't right. At first there was nothing. Just the white spread of winter, the dark underbrush, the hush of trees holding breath. Then, a depression in the snow. Shallow, subtle, like someone had curled up and pressed the world away. Silas knelt. The snow here wasn't just sunken, it was disturbed. The top layer had melted slightly, then frozen again. The kind of change that comes from body heat barely holding on. Boone circled once, then lay down beside it, his nose twitching. Silas brushed away the top layer of snow. There, fabric, a thin, faded blanket frayed at the edges. Beneath it, a whimper, small, fragile, human. Silas's pulse quickened. He pulled the blanket back slowly. There was a woman, curled around something. No, someone. Two someones. Infants, wrapped in what looked like scarves, one in each arm. The woman's face was pale, lips cracked. Her eyes fluttered open, barely. She didn't speak, just tightened her arms. A flicker of panic crossing her face before the cold overpowered even fear. Boone pressed his body closer, offering what warmth he had left. His fur brushed against the woman's arm. She didn't recoil. Maybe she didn't even register him. Silas didn't speak. What could be said in a moment like this? He took off his coat, wrapped it around the three of them, lifted slowly, arms full of weight that felt impossibly light. Boone walked beside him, not ahead, as if knowing this wasn't about chasing. It was about bringing something back. Back to the cabin, back to heat, back to a place where maybe, just maybe, the breath of three almost forgottens could turn steady again. But what kind of world leaves a woman and two newborns in the snow? And who or what had she been running from? Into this silence. Silas didn't ask, not yet. Some truths don't need to be chased. They arrive when the fire is lit and the heart has thawed just enough to speak. The road back to the cabin was barely visible under the growing weight of snow. The tires slid once near a bend, but Silas corrected without a word, his jaw set, eyes steady. Boone sat behind him now, curled around the woman and the two infants bundled in his old parka. His thick coat pressed up against them, a silent heater with eyes that never blinked. The woman hadn't spoken again. Her head rested loosely against Silas's shoulder during the lift, but now leaned forward in a shallow, unconscious curl. The babies made no noise, not from peace but from exhaustion. Inside the truck, the only sound was the creak of the heater struggling against the mountain air and the faint, wet breath of Boone. Snow brushed the windshield like falling sand. The world outside vanished into gray-white shadows. The world inside was equally still. They reached the cabin in under 15 minutes. Silas parked close to the porch, left the engine running. The door groaned as he opened it, cold rushing in like a second guest. He moved quickly, but not rushed, unfastening the coats, securing the woman and babies in his arms. Boone leapt down before him, shook once, then padded toward the door, nosing it open before Silas reached the steps. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and thyme. No food, no noise, just dry heat lingering from the last fire he'd made that morning. Silas placed the woman and the babies on the couch closest to the wood stove. His old flannel throw was still there, unused for years, kept mostly for when Boone used to come back wet from the rain. He covered them gently, then turned to the hearth. The fire took fast. Dry pine needles and fat wood caught in seconds. The warmth began to rise, slow and steady, like something learning to trust again. Boone settled beside the couch, body angled protectively. He didn't lie down, not yet. His ears, one of them half folded since the accident, twitched with every creak of wood. He watched the woman. Not with fear, not with suspicion, with presence. Silas made no attempt to wake her. He poured hot water into a tin kettle and left it on the stove, pulled another quilt from the chest near the door, and folded it over the couch, just above the infants' heads. He sat down on the far rocking chair. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the windows like someone testing if the house would answer. Inside, nobody spoke. The fire snapped once and one of the babies stirred. A small hand rose from the cocoon of scarves and moved, reaching blindly, before returning to stillness. The woman flinched in her sleep. Or maybe it was her body adjusting to heat again. Her lips moved slightly, a breath, a name maybe, but nothing audible, nothing clear. Silas leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Boone still hadn't moved. Minutes passed like hours. It wasn't the first time he'd seen someone near freezing. But this was different. This wasn't a hiker lost, or a stranded motorist. This was someone who'd chosen the edge of nowhere, chosen or been forced. And how far does a mother have to run before a cardboard box in the snow feels safer than wherever she came from? Silas watched her, not as a lawman, not as a rescuer, just as someone who had once stood in a room where everything had gone quiet, and wondered if the silence would ever end. The babies breathed. Boone blinked. The wind howled softly and then softened. And still, the woman slept. Silas reached for a folded towel and dipped it in the kettle's steam. He wrang it out, knelt beside the couch, and gently wiped her forehead. Her skin was ice under the heat. She stirred slightly, then settled again. Boone exhaled through his nose, a low, huffing sound, the kind he made when storms were passing, when things were close to right. Silas sat back down, the rocking chair creaking once. Outside, snow piled silently along the window ledge. The clock above the fireplace ticked, but not loudly. This place had held nothing but one man and one dog for years. Nothing new had been allowed in. No mail, no guests, no birthdays. Only the echo of hammer on wood, coffee going cold, and the occasional bark when Boone caught scent of a fox too close to the porch. And now, a woman, 2 infants, a question in human shape, lying quiet and still beside a fire neither of them had built. What comes next? Do you ask her name? Do you wait for her to speak? Do you pretend this is just another shift that ends with a report and a silent ride home? Or do you simply sit, like Boone does, and wait, with your eyes open and your heart quiet, for what the silence might tell you, if you dare to listen? Dawn didn't break so much as arrive unnoticed. Outside the cabin, the snowfall had slowed, but not stopped. The world remained blanketed in a dull, muffled gray. Trees stood silent under the weight of white, and the wind had retreated into the far ridges, as if exhausted from the night. Inside, the fire whispered. It had burned through most of the pine wood, leaving behind a deep amber glow, crackling quietly into the early morning. The woman, still unnamed, had not moved much. Her arms remained curved around the 2 small bundles on the couch, her face pale and unreadable in the low light. Silas hadn't slept. He rarely did these days. He sat at the edge of the kitchen table, eyes drifting occasionally to the window, but mostly to Boone, who hadn't shifted his guard. Not once. Boone had taken a place near the couch, back legs folded, front paws stretched, head lowered but eyes half open. Every now and then, his ears twitched, responding not to sound, but to presence. Boone felt things long before Silas could name them. Maybe that was what made him such a fine search dog in the old days. Or maybe that was just Boone. There was something about the stillness now that felt expectant, not tense, not peaceful, just waiting. Silas stood, joints stiff, and moved slowly to the hearth. He added 2 fresh logs, nudged the coals with the iron poker, watched the orange spark return. The heat deepened, sending a faint wave across the floorboards. He adjusted the kettle and glanced at the clock. 6:03 a.m. The woman stirred. Not much, a breath, her shoulders shifting against the flannel. Then, her eyes, they opened. At first she looked upward, as if trying to recall where she was. The ceiling, bare wooden beams, dim. Then down, to the babies pressed against her chest. She moved one arm slightly, brushing their cheeks with the back of her hand, checking, breathing, warmth, skin. Then her eyes found Boone. She didn't flinch, just blinked. Boone didn't move, didn't avert his gaze. He simply looked back. It went on like that for several seconds, and then, the smallest sound, a whisper, not even a full word. "Where?" Her voice broke like frost underfoot. Silas stepped forward, but didn't speak right away. He knelt beside the couch again, not too close. "You're safe," he said. Voice low, steady. The woman looked at him, her eyes still glazed, not with fear, but the residue of too many nights lost to cold and doubt. She nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. "You're in my cabin," Silas continued. "Flatwoods, about 20 miles from anything with cell service." She shifted again, her body curling tighter as the infant stirred in sleep. The boy, smaller, maybe by a pound, let out a faint sigh. The girl twitched once, a hand escaping the wrap. "I found you last night," Silas said. "You were under the spruce by Timber Ridge. I was on patrol." The woman's eyes moved to Boone again, then back to Silas. "Is this your dog?" Silas looked at Boone, then back at her. "His name's Boone. He used to search for people buried under avalanches. Doesn't move fast now, but he still knows where to look." The woman closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek, catching in the ridge between her nose and lip. "I wasn't buried," she whispered. "Not yet." Silas said nothing. The fire snapped. Boone rose, stretched his front legs one at a time, then walked to the other side of the couch, settling again near the baby's feet. His head rested lightly against the girl's blanket. The woman watched him. "What's your name?" Silas asked gently. She paused. Not as if she didn't know it, but as if she were weighing whether to share it. "Ellen," she said finally. "Ellen Miles." Silas nodded once. The babies stirred again. Ellen turned slightly to cradle them better. Her movements were slow, worn down by time, fatigue, and something deeper, the heaviness of having been no one for too long. "You can stay here until you're stronger," Silas offered. Ellen didn't respond, not with words, but her eyes didn't dart to the door. She didn't ask how long. She didn't protest. Silas turned and stepped toward the kitchen, poured a mug of warm water and brought it back. Ellen took it with both hands, fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas nodded again but said nothing. He sat back in the rocker, facing the fire, the woman, the children, Boone. For a long while the cabin returned to quiet. Not the kind of quiet that came from absence, but the kind that settles into a room when people no longer feel the need to speak, when the weight of breath, presence, and flame is enough. Outside, a branch dropped snow onto the tin roof with a dull thud. Inside, Boone blinked. Ellen lifted the girl's hand and kissed her knuckles, wordless. Silas leaned back. And somewhere in that silence, without announcement or drama, the cabin became more than a place. It became a pause in someone's running. But how long can a pause hold when the world beyond is still watching? The storm didn't return, but the wind never fully left. Outside the cabin, flurries rose and fell like breath. The forest remained hushed, heavy with unspoken things. Light crept in, not golden, not bright, just soft enough to remind the trees it was morning. Inside, warmth had taken root. The fire was steady now. Boone had finally laid his head down fully, his body curled protectively at the base of the couch. One ear twitched every few minutes. Even in rest, he watched. Ellen hadn't moved far since waking. She hadn't stood, hadn't asked for anything. She only held the children, Ruby and Finn, their tiny chests lifting beneath wool and borrowed cloth. Her arms, though thin and trembling, never let go, not even to drink the water Silas offered. When she looked around the room, her eyes landed not on the walls or windows, but on the quiet things, the frayed edge of the rug. The way Boone's chest moved, the half-burned log in the fire, and Silas, not speaking, just being, across the room. She watched him the way a person watches the shore after nearly drowning, waiting to see if it would hold. Silas finally spoke. "Names?" Ellen blinked. He nodded toward the babies, his voice low, never pressing. "Do they have them?" She looked down, surprised by the question, or maybe by the fact that she still remembered to answer it. "The girl is Ruby," she said, barely above a whisper. "The boy's Finn." Silas nodded. He didn't write them down, didn't ask for dates of birth or last names, or whose names were on paper. In the cabin, names weren't for records. They were for remembering that someone existed. Ruby made a soft sound then. Not a cry, but something like the beginning of one. Ellen shifted, swaying slightly, her hand gently rocking the child against her shoulder. Boone rose. Slowly he stepped closer, then sat beside Ellen, looking up at her like someone waiting for a sign. She looked back. There was hesitation in her shoulders, but something in Boone's posture, the weight of his gaze, the calm rootedness of it, made her relax. He placed his head gently on her knee. Ellen's hand moved, uncertain at first, and touched the side of Boone's neck. She didn't pet him, just rested her hand there as if surprised he was real. Then came the tears, not loud, not frantic, just steady. Her face crumpled softly, her breath caught in her chest. She lowered her head toward Ruby, lips pressing against the child's forehead, then Finn's. One arm tightened around them both, and Boone stayed where he was, didn't move, didn't flinch. Only his tail thumped once, slow against the floor. Silas remained still across the room. Ellen didn't speak, and he didn't ask her to. There were moments that needed to be carried in silence, not named, not solved. When the tears passed, Ellen reached for the tin cup on the table beside her. The water was cold now. She drank it anyway. "I thought we wouldn't make it," she said finally, her voice rough but controlled. Silas waited. "I thought we'd just disappear out there, like animals." Boone let out a long exhale, and Ellen's eyes flicked down to him. She gave him the smallest nod, almost an apology. "They said I was nothing," she murmured. The fire crackled. No one corrected her. Not yet. She looked up at Silas. "Why did you stop?" Silas met her gaze. There was no pride in his voice when he answered. "I didn't." He looked toward Boone. "He did." Ellen glanced down again. Boone lifted his head just enough to meet her eyes. "Is he trained for this?" Silas shook his head once. "He just knows where to look." Ellen let that sit for a long time, then, finally, she spoke again. "I didn't tell anyone where we were going, not even when we left the last shelter." Silas nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Let's keep it that way." Ellen gave a brittle smile. It was the first trace of lightness on her face. Boone moved closer, pressing his side gently against the couch. Ruby, half asleep, turned toward him in her sleep. Her hand touched fur. The fire dimmed slightly. Silas stood and added one more log. Outside, the trees swayed like someone breathing deep. And in the hush between snowflakes, a mother, 2 children, a tired dog, and a quiet man sat inside something that looked nothing like rescue, and everything like the beginning of staying. But how long before the world outside remembers who she was, and comes knocking. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar smoke and soap. Later that morning, once the children were fed and wrapped warm, Ellen asked if she could clean herself up. She didn't say it loudly, just looked toward the small hallway near the back and touched her hair lightly, as if remembering she still had some control left. Silas pointed her gently to the bathroom. He didn't follow, didn't offer towels or ask if she needed help. He just nodded once and let her pass. Boone watched her go, then lay back down near the cradle Silas had built years ago from leftover pine wood. It hadn't been used until now. The children slept, Ruby curled tighter, Finn looser, already different in the way they dreamed. When Ellen came back, her wet hair was brushed back, and her face, clean, pale, new, held a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. She wore a flannel shirt, too big for her frame, its sleeves rolled 3 times over wrists that seemed thinner now. She held herself carefully, as if every part of her had become glass. Silas noticed the marks. He didn't stare, just stood, leaning against the kitchen counter, letting the fire speak instead. But the bruises were there, a fading yellow along her left cheekbone, a dark smear near her ribs, partially hidden by the shirt, and her wrists, red, not fresh, but not old enough to forget. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. Boone, though, stood up again and walked toward her. This time Ellen dropped her eyes. Not from fear, but from something closer to shame. Boone nudged her leg gently, then sat down and waited. "I don't know why he trusts me," she whispered. Silas answered from across the room. "He doesn't do that for everyone." Ellen looked toward him. "So why me?" Silas shook his head. "Might not be about you." That answer hung in the air like wood smoke, sharp and slow to leave. Ellen moved toward the chair by the fire and sat, her knees drawn slightly up. She wrapped her arms around her waist as if holding something invisible in place. Ruby let out a soft cough from the cradle. Ellen stood immediately, walked over, adjusted the blanket. She didn't speak to the child, didn't hum or shush, just placed a hand on the baby's chest and closed her eyes. Silas watched the shape of her back, not tense but braced. "You hungry?" he asked after a time. Ellen opened her eyes, considered the question, then nodded once. He scooped 2 bowls of oatmeal from a pot he'd left on the stove, still warm, set one on the table for her. The other he held loosely while walking to the rocker. Ellen sat but didn't eat. Instead, she looked down at her forearms and slowly, as if checking to see if she had permission, rolled the sleeves a little higher. Silas caught the motion without looking straight at her. Red bands, faint rope burns, the kind that didn't come from restraint, the kind that came from punishment. Still, he didn't speak. He let the silence hold her, not to corner, not to dig, but to allow her to choose the weight she wanted to set down. After a while, she did. When we ran, I thought I'd feel freer." She didn't lift her gaze. "I thought crossing the state line would feel like crossing into something else, a life that wasn't his." Boone walked to the hearth and lay down again, his breath slow, his eyes still open. Ellen didn't cry this time. Her voice didn't break. "But I was still scared," she continued, "even when I found the box, even when I wrapped them up. I thought, maybe he was right. Maybe I don't get to leave." Silas stirred his oatmeal once. Boone blinked slowly, like he'd heard every word. "Do you think some people," Ellen said after a long silence, "are just meant to disappear?" Silas finally looked at her. Not hard, not soft, just looked. "I think," he said slowly, "that anyone still holding on deserves to be seen." Ellen let out a long breath, and for the first time her shoulders dropped, not from defeat, but from weight beginning to shift. She reached for the oatmeal, took a bite, and Boone exhaled, turning once before curling tighter. Outside, the wind passed like an old friend, brushing the walls but not knocking. Inside, there were bruises and names, but there was also warmth and eyes that didn't look away. But what happens when someone starts looking for what they think still belongs to them? The snow fell again that night. Not in flurries or gusts, but the kind of fall that blanketed everything without asking. The trees bent slightly under the weight, but made no protest. The road that led up to Silas's cabin disappeared once more, like it had never been there. Inside, Ellen slept on the couch again. She hadn't asked for a bed. She never did. The babies lay curled against her side, the only warmth she trusted. Boone sat at his post near the window, his body still. His ears, one tilted always now, flicked once at a groan in the wood, then settled again. He wasn't a guard dog, not anymore, but he was watching. Silas hadn't gone to bed either. He sat by the kitchen table, the glow of his old laptop casting a pale square across the wood. The screen was slow, the satellite internet spottier in winter, but it worked. He searched with purpose, fingers moving slowly, names, reports, county court filings. He didn't type Ellen Miles. That would be too obvious, too noisy. Instead, he started with shelters across West Virginia and Kentucky. He found one, 9 months back, with a single entry that stood out. Woman arrived with 2 newborns, unnamed, stayed 3 nights, refused transport, left during snowstorm. There was no name on the intake form, but the handwriting, it felt tired. Silas leaned back. Boone turned to glance at him, then looked away. He moved on. Police logs, civil court archives, protection orders filed and withdrawn. Missoula, Montana, Jackson, Wyoming. Names floated to the surface like bruises under skin. Then, a report from 3 years prior. Carlton Miles. Known alias, Carl Miles. Arrested for domestic assault. Charges dropped. Plaintiff uncooperative. Another file. Temporary restraining order requested by spouse. Silas opened it. The digital scan crackled. And there it was. Ellen's signature. Slanted, hard-pressed, fading by the second page. No middle name, just Ellen Miles, followed by a short note in barely readable print. He told me no one would help me twice. Silas closed the file slowly. He didn't speak, but his hand curled loosely into a fist. Boone stood, walked over, slow, careful, rested his head near Silas's boot. They didn't move for some time. When Silas finally shut the laptop, the fire was low again. He walked quietly toward it, fed the flame, watched it rise, gentle and reluctant. Outside, something shifted. Boone raised his head. Silas walked to the door, looked out. Nothing. But he knew the feeling. That old edge in his chest. Not danger, not yet, but the echo of something circling. Back inside, he returned to the table, pulled out a drawer. Inside it, an old folder, one he hadn't touched in years. Dust still on the corners. He removed a single paper from it, folded neatly, a contact card. R. Henley, Emergency Case Support Unit, Kentucky Division. He stared at it for a long time. Didn't pick up the phone, not yet. Instead, he turned toward the couch. Ellen wasn't sleeping anymore. She lay still. Yes, but her eyes were open. She hadn't moved when he walked through the cabin. Hadn't interrupted. But she saw everything. Their eyes met across the room. You found him, didn't you? She asked softly. Silas didn't answer. Ellen sat up slightly, arms wrapping tighter around Ruby and Finn. You don't have to tell me, she said. I felt it, the way the room changed. Silas leaned against the wall near the window. He didn't look at her directly. He's out there, she continued. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but he's always out there. Silas turned toward her now. His voice was calm. Not here. Ellen gave a tired smile, the kind someone gives when they've heard comfort before but never kept it. I used to think if I ran far enough it would stop. She adjusted Finn's blanket. But he's not just a man. He's in everything. In the sound of tires on gravel, in a knock that takes too long, in silence that lasts too short. Boone walked over then, sat near her again. She didn't flinch this time. She placed a hand gently on his head. Silas finally moved to the table again. He picked up the contact card, looked at it. You ever think, Ellen said suddenly, that maybe some people were never meant to be found? Silas paused, then answered, not looking up. I think some people were meant to be found exactly once. He slid the card into his back pocket. Didn't explain, didn't promise. But the silence that followed felt different now. Not safer, but maybe more shared. And in the low glow of firelight, with Boone guarding the edge of the couch, and Silas folding into thought, Ellen closed her eyes. She didn't sleep, not yet, but she rested, and sometimes, in the cold hush of a mountain winter, that's the closest thing to healing there is. But what happens when the past doesn't knock? It breaks the lock. It began with the wind, not a scream, not even a howl, just the kind of low whistle that wraps itself around eaves and fence posts, the kind that makes a man step quietly to the window and listen, even when he's not sure what he's listening for. Silas didn't move at first. He sat in the rocker, mug in hand, boots off, his body folded slightly toward the fire. Boone was beside him, not asleep but settled, chest rising slow, eyes half shut, ears still alive to the outside. It was just past midnight. The babies had fallen back into a fragile sleep after a late feeding. Ellen was curled on the couch again, one arm across Finn, her other hand loosely cradling Ruby's foot through the blanket. There was nothing unusual in the cabin. No movement, no voice, no light out of place. But Boone stood. Not suddenly. He simply rose, a slow, practiced movement. His front paws stepped one by one onto the floor. He walked to the door, not barking, not growling, just standing there, looking. Silas followed. He didn't speak. He reached for the flashlight beside the coat rack, checked the battery with one thumb, then reached above the doorframe and removed the old revolver, the one he hadn't touched in 2 years. He opened it, counted. 5. Still there. Outside, the trees swayed, but not enough to explain what Boone was hearing. Silas clicked off the safety but didn't open the door. Instead, he stepped to the side, his shoulder pressing to the wall. He leaned in close and looked through the narrow vertical slit he'd carved long ago into the cabin's structure, a precaution from another life. There were no headlights, no footsteps, but the snow, it was disturbed. Not much, just one line of interruption, like something or someone had passed through in the last hour and wasn't meant to be seen. Boone let out a low sound then, not a bark, not even a warning, just a breath, deep, from the belly. Ellen stirred. She sat up slowly, eyes still clouded with sleep, but narrowing in alertness. What is it? She whispered, already pulling the babies closer. Silas didn't answer. Instead, He stepped quietly toward her, kneeling beside the couch. "Take them," he said softly, "and go to the back room." Her face went pale, but she didn't freeze. She nodded once, bundled the twins quickly, precisely. Not with panic, with practice. Boone moved with her, following close as she crossed into the shadows of the hallway. At the end of the corridor, a closet door opened, then clicked quietly closed behind them. Silas waited. The fire crackled once. He turned back toward the door. It was then, only then, that he heard it. A scratch. Light. Too light for an animal, too controlled for a branch. Just a slow drag across wood, from left to right, just below the handle. Silas stepped to the side again, looking through the slit. Still nothing. He reached for the bolt, slid it silently open. Waited. Then he opened the door, just a few inches. Nothing stood on the porch. But to the left, half buried in snow, was a single footprint. A man's boot, deep tread, fresh. No pattern of approach, no sign of departure. Just one, like someone wanted to remind him this cabin was no longer invisible. Boone returned then. Silas looked down at the dog's face. Boone's stance was stiff, his gaze hard set toward the trees. "I know," Silas whispered. "I see it too." He shut the door, re-bolted it, turned off the porch light. The cabin now was held in shadow. Boone returned to the center of the room, positioning himself between the hallway and the door. Ellen hadn't come out. She wouldn't, not unless called, and Silas wouldn't call her. Not yet. Instead, he stood there, listening. The wind passed again. A tree creaked in the far distance, and far out beyond the trees, something else, listening back. The rest of the night passed like that. Uneasy. Still. Not a single other sound followed. But the single scratch on the door remained. By morning, the snow had covered it. But Silas didn't forget. And neither did Boone. The sun came late. Flatwoods never rushed the morning. But that day, even the sky seemed reluctant to rise. The cabin was quiet. But it wasn't the kind of quiet that came from peace. It was the kind that waited to see if the night had truly ended. Silas stood on the porch with a mug of black coffee gone cold in his hand. His boots were planted in a new drift of snow. Boone sat beside him, not looking at the trees but listening to them, the way only dogs can. The footprint from the night before was gone. The snow had buried it like everything else. But Silas didn't need to see it again. He remembered the tread, the direction, the distance from the door. A man doesn't forget the first warning sign. He stepped back inside. Ellen was already awake. She was sitting at the table, the twins wrapped close to her chest in a sling made from an old flannel. Ruby slept. Finn was awake, blinking slowly at the fire. Her face was tired but not fragile. Something had shifted in her. She looked up when Silas came in, but didn't say good morning, just waited. Silas poured a second cup, sat down. "I made a call," he said. Ellen's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table. "To a friend," he continued. "Used to work in mountain rescue. Now he runs a temporary shelter station, remote, deep woods, cameras, one road in, one road out." Ellen waited. "He can get you there by nightfall, quietly." She didn't blink, didn't move. "I know it's not what you wanted," Silas added. Still nothing. Then, softly, she spoke. "If I go, I'm just running again." Silas didn't argue. "He'll find me eventually." "He always does." Silas set his mug down gently. "But here," she said, "at least I can see what's coming." Boone rose and walked toward her. Sat by the cradle, eyes on the back wall, as if he too remembered the sound that wasn't quite a knock. Ellen looked at him, then back to Silas. I can't live like prey, Silas. I already did. She didn't raise her voice. I'd rather he come, and I face him, than keep pretending I'm invisible. Silas didn't reply. He simply studied her face, not with pity, but with recognition. You don't have to decide now, he said after a long silence. I already did, she said. Boone let out a quiet huff. Not a protest, just presence. Silas nodded once. You won't be alone, he said. Ellen looked at him for a long time. The fire snapped behind her. She didn't cry. Not this time. She just reached over and brushed a small piece of lint from Ruby's sleeve. It was almost noon when Silas walked into the storage room. He opened the old chest near the back, the one that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were supplies he hadn't planned to use again. A radio scanner, maps, 2 wool blankets from a rescue kit, and a folded copy of the guardianship application form. He didn't bring it out. Not yet. Later, while Ellen rested on the couch with the children, Boone curled up close and Silas sat by the hearth, carving a small stick of cedar. Not for purpose, just for the rhythm of it. I used to make things, he said. Ellen didn't open her eyes, but he knew she was listening. Furniture, doors, toys once. He turned the stick slowly in his fingers, but I stopped. Boone turned his head slightly, ears tilted. Not because I didn't want to, Silas said, but because after the fire, nothing felt like it had a place anymore. He looked over at her. But maybe it's not about making things that last. Maybe it's about making something that holds, even for a little while. Ellen said nothing, but a tear slid silently from the corner of her eye. Later that evening, she wrote something down on a torn page from an old notebook. When she left the room, Silas found it beside Boone. If something happens to me, don't let anyone split them up, especially Ruby. She's the one who sees the goodness in things. She sees it even when I can't. Boone sniffed the page, then laid his paw across it. Silas didn't move it. Outside, the trees shivered in the wind. Inside, 3 people and 1 dog stayed, not because they weren't afraid, but because sometimes staying is the bravest kind of running. But how long can a cabin hold back the storm if the storm already knows your name? The snowfall paused that afternoon. Not cleared, just paused. The sky hovered low, thick with waiting, as though something needed to finish arriving before it could begin again. Inside the cabin, Ellen was asleep on the couch, one hand resting on Ruby's small back. Finn nestled in the crook of her other arm. Boone lay beneath the coffee table, his body still, tail flicking once with each crackle from the fireplace. Silas sat at the kitchen table again, a pen in one hand, a printed form spread out in front of him. West Virginia petition for emergency guardianship. The space for his name was already filled in. Deputy Silas Kent. He didn't rush the rest. There were boxes to check, reasons to give, declarations to make. But the form wasn't why he hesitated. It was the weight of it. What it meant to write a promise into paper. To say, if she cannot, I will. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the torn page Ellen had left beside Boone. Her handwriting wasn't neat. Some words smudged, a corner torn. Don't let anyone split them up, especially Ruby. Silas looked across the room again. The girl stirred in her sleep, pressing her small head tighter to her mother's chest. He filled in the last line of the form, then folded it, slipped it into the envelope, sealed it. Outside, the wind returned. It sounded different now. Boone's ears pricked. He rose, moved toward the door again, not fast, not loud, but purposeful. Silas stood too. He didn't reach for his gun this time. He opened the door. A single envelope had been slid under the wood. No footprints this time, no voice. Just the envelope. No return address. Just a single name on the front. Ellen Miles. He brought it inside. Set it on the table, didn't open it. Let it sit there. Ellen stirred a little later. The fire had dimmed, casting long orange lines across the floorboards. She saw the envelope first. She didn't move toward it, just stared. Then finally, with the care of someone touching a live wire, she reached for it and turned it over. Inside was a photograph. Not new, a picture of her and Carl from their wedding. She in a dress that didn't fit her shoulders right. He in a dark suit, smiling too wide. Folded with the photo, a typed message, brief. I see you, I always do. She didn't cry. She just folded the photo back, put it on the mantel beside the fire, then walked back to the couch. Picked up Ruby, held her close. Silas didn't ask what it said. He'd seen enough. The silence deepened around them. Boone sat at the threshold between rooms, guarding. Silas walked to the cabinet, pulled out an old backpack, filled it with supplies he'd packed once, long ago, when he still believed he might need to disappear too. Canned food, formula, 2 emergency blankets, flashlight, hand crank radio. Then he walked to the coat rack, took down the only thing hanging there besides his own jacket, a small, faded blue parka, the kind made for mountain wind. He folded it into the pack, zipped it. He didn't speak. Boone moved closer to him, nose twitching at the bag. Ellen watched from the couch. "You're not taking us away," she said, a question hidden somewhere in the statement. Silas shook his head. "Not unless we have to." She nodded once. Boone returned to her side. The night came early. The trees stood like guards, cloaked in frost and dark. Inside the cabin, the fire never quite went out. Later, Ellen added a second note to the first, this time folded inside the cradle beside Ruby. "If I'm not here tomorrow, tell them I stayed because no one should grow up thinking the world doesn't hold a place for them. Not again." Silas read it in the morning. He didn't move it. Just sat beside the cradle, eyes on the fire. Boone came and laid his head on his lap. He scratched behind the dog's ear. "We hold until morning," he said softly. "Then we see what comes. But what if morning isn't the end of the storm? Just the part where it breaks through the door?" 2 months passed. Not quickly. Not easily. But they passed, the way a long winter passes through a place like Flatwoods, by not asking for permission. Spring didn't announce itself with color or sound. It arrived in fragments, a drip from the roof, a patch of mud beneath the swing, the sound of birds too early in the morning. The snow had retreated from the edge of the woods, leaving behind damp ground and pale grass, trying to remember what sunlight felt like. The cabin remained, still standing, still quiet. Inside, the fire wasn't burning all the time anymore. Silas only lit it at dusk, when the babies grew fussy, or when the shadows made Ellen fold in on herself a little more than usual. Boone still slept by the door, but now, sometimes, he wandered out to the porch in the early evening, sitting just far enough to feel the breeze, ears moving, eyes half closed, like he no longer needed to watch so closely. Ruby had begun to crawl, not fast, not far, but enough. She'd crawl to Boone, press her hand to his side, then giggle when he exhaled like a tired old man. Finn was slower, more watchful. He stared longer, cried less. Silas didn't speak much still, but his hands had changed. They moved more now, around the kitchen, fixing small things, carving wood again, Not for purpose, but for practice. He made a cradle out of cedar. Didn't ask if Ellen wanted one. Just did it. When he brought it inside, she didn't say anything. Just placed both children into it, tucked side by side, and whispered, "They've never slept that well before." There was no word for what the three of them had become. Not quite family, not quite strangers. Just people who had survived a season together and decided, quietly, to stay. One morning, a letter came, not slid under a door, not dropped in silence, but delivered, properly, by post. It was from the county courthouse. Notice of approved guardianship, Ruby Miles and Finn Miles. Secondary guardian, Deputy Silas Kent. Ellen read it first. Her hands trembled, but not from fear, from something else, a relief maybe, or the slow realization that nothing, not even fear, lasts forever when someone stays. She placed the letter on the mantel beside the photo of her mother, and the first tiny drawing Ruby had ever scribbled in red crayon. Then she turned to Silas. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Didn't speak. Boone huffed at their feet. Later that week, they walked into town, all four of them. Silas carried the twins in an old canvas sling across his chest. Ellen walked beside him in a coat too big, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. Boone led, no leash, his tail low but swinging, as if he finally trusted the road ahead. They walked into the courthouse, signed papers, confirmed statements. Judge Molly Brenner, a tall woman with silver hair and eyes like polished stone, stamped the forms without hesitation. "You sure about this?" she asked Silas. He didn't look at her. "I'm sure." Then it was done. No applause, no music, just a stamped seal and a sigh from Ellen that sounded like something inside her had finally unclenched. Back at the cabin, Silas grilled 2 steaks on the porch. Boone lay beside the steps, head high, watching the sky shift from gold to deep blue. Ellen sat on a quilt in the grass, Ruby asleep against her chest, Finn reaching one chubby hand toward a butterfly he'd never catch. Silas walked over, handed her a plate. She took it. They didn't eat right away. Just watched the valley, alive again. "I prayed," Ellen said, barely above the wind. "That night, in the snow. Not for me, but for them. I didn't ask for rescue. I asked for someone who wouldn't look away." Silas didn't respond. She turned to him. "I never thought it'd be you." He looked at Boone. The old dog's eyes were closed now, but his ears still twitched with every movement. He wasn't guarding anymore, just resting in the company he chose. "Boone found you," Silas said. "I just followed him." Ellen smiled. Not the kind that disappears. She looked down at her children, then back at the cabin. "Do you think broken people make good parents?" Silas didn't answer right away. He set down his plate, sat beside her, then reached for her hand, rough, calloused, tired. "I think broken people know how to fight for light," he said. "And that's the only kind of good that matters." She didn't cry, just leaned slightly against him. Boone shifted, tail thumping once against the wood. The sun dipped behind the ridge. The air cooled, but no one moved to go inside. Sometimes, the ending doesn't come with a door slamming or a villain falling. Sometimes, it's just a quiet meal on the porch, a baby breathing steady, and a dog who doesn't need to bark anymore. Sometimes, the miracle isn't the rescue. It's the staying, and the silence that follows, when no one's afraid to close their eyes. Not every storm ends with the sky clearing. Some just leave behind enough quiet for people to breathe again. In the end, it wasn't the badge, the paperwork, or even the law that saved Ruby and Finn. It was presence. A man who stayed, a dog who listened, a woman who chose not to run one more time. We live in a world where many people disappear, not all at once, but slowly, when no one notices they've been silent too long. But sometimes, all it takes is someone who doesn't look away. If this story found you at the right time, or reminded you of someone who once stayed by your side when the world felt cold, would you share that with us in the comments? We'd love to know. Have you ever met someone, or some animal, who changed your life simply by staying? May this story stay with you, and may you stay for someone when it matters most.